I am Rebecca, 32 years old, and the CEO of my own real estate development company. When people see the silver bracelet I always wear on my left wrist, they usually compliment its elegant design. What they don't know is that it covers the rope marks that never quite faded completely. The marks from the night my own family tied me to a chair and threatened to throw me out on the streets with nothing but the clothes on my back. That night changed everything, setting me on a path that would eventually lead to last Saturday's housewarming party, where I walked into my cousin's new home, carrying a $20 candle from Target, and left having handed them something that would change their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado, I learned early that family loyalty was a one-way street in the Martinez household. Our house sat on a corner lot in a middle-class neighborhood, where everyone knew each other's business and appearances mattered more than truth. My parents, Carmen and Roberto Martinez, ran a small but successful landscaping business that had been in our family for 2 generations. The American dream, they called it, built with sweat and sacrifice. But inside our walls, the dream looked more like a carefully orchestrated nightmare, where I played the role of the family disappointment, while my cousin Daniel, who lived with us after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, became the golden child they never had. Daniel was 3 years older than me, charming in that easy way that made adults instantly adore him. He had dark eyes that sparkled when he laughed, and a smile that could convince anyone of anything. Teachers loved him, neighbors praised him, and my parents treated him like the son they had always wanted instead of the daughter they actually got. I was 9 when Daniel moved in with us, and I remember being excited about having a big brother figure in the house. That excitement died quickly when I realized that Daniel's arrival meant my invisible status in the family became even more pronounced. Before Daniel, I was simply ignored or criticized. After Daniel, I became the measuring stick by which his perfection was constantly highlighted. When Daniel brought home a report card with B's and C's, my parents celebrated his effort and took him out for ice cream. When I brought home straight A's, they questioned whether my teachers were being too easy on me. When Daniel forgot to do his chores, it was because he was busy with more important things like helping neighbors or studying. When I forgot anything, it was evidence of my inherent irresponsibility and disrespect for the family. The message was clear from the beginning. Daniel belonged, and I was tolerated. Daniel deserved investment and encouragement, while I needed constant correction and criticism. My parents poured their hopes, dreams and resources into molding Daniel into their vision of success, while treating me like an obligation they couldn't wait to be done with. By the time I was in middle school, the pattern was firmly established. Daniel played soccer and my parents never missed a game, cheering from the sidelines and organizing team parties. I joined the debate team and won multiple regional competitions, but my parents claimed they were too busy with work to attend even the championship rounds. When I begged them to come to at least one tournament, my mother sighed and said that some children were naturally attention-seeking and needed to learn that the world didn't revolve around them. Daniel was naturally popular, effortlessly making friends and dating girls who giggled whenever he walked by. I was studious and quiet, preferring books to parties and finding social interactions exhausting after spending all day trying to read the mood of my own family. This difference was used as further evidence that Daniel was normal and well-adjusted while I was antisocial and difficult. What hurt the most was that Daniel never defended me or questioned the disparity in how we were treated. He basked in the favoritism, as if it were his natural right, never once acknowledging that my parents' praise of him often came at the expense of criticism directed at me. When my parents would compare us openly at the dinner table, listing all the ways Daniel was excelling while I was falling short, he would just smile and accept the compliments as if they weren't being delivered as weapons aimed at my self-esteem. The financial disparity was perhaps the most obvious manifestation of the favoritism. Daniel got a car for his 16th birthday, a used but reliable Honda that my parents spent weeks shopping for to find the perfect one. I got a lecture about how getting my license was a privilege that had to be earned through better grades, better behavior, and a better attitude. The fact that my grades were already higher than Daniel's was apparently irrelevant. When it came time for college applications, my parents hired a private counselor to help Daniel navigate the process and identify schools that would be good fits for his interests and abilities. They paid for test prep courses and application fees for a dozen different universities. When I started looking at colleges, I was told that I could research schools on my own time using the library computer, and if I wanted to apply anywhere, I would need to pay the application fees myself. Daniel chose to study business at Colorado State University, a decision my parents supported wholeheartedly. They set up a college fund for him that covered tuition, housing and living expenses, plus extra money for emergencies and social activities. They bought him everything he needed for his dorm room and drove him to campus themselves, taking pictures and crying with pride as they helped him move in. I decided to study computer science at the University of Colorado Boulder, a choice that my parents met with skepticism and criticism. Technology was just a fad, my mother insisted, and I should focus on something more practical and feminine like teaching or nursing. When I explained that computer science was actually an incredibly practical field with excellent job prospects, my father rolled his eyes and said I was just trying to be difficult and different for attention. More importantly, they informed me that while they had saved money for Daniel's education because he was like a son to them, they expected me to figure out my own way to pay for college. After all, they reasoned I was so smart and independent that I surely didn't need their help the way Daniel did. They were sure I would find scholarships and financial aid on my own. The message was unmistakable: Daniel was family, worthy of investment and support. I was just someone who happened to live in the same house, expected to be grateful for basic necessities while making my own way in the world. I applied for every scholarship I could find, worked part-time jobs throughout high school to save money, and ultimately cobbled together enough financial aid to make college possible. But the disparity in how we were treated left scars that went deeper than financial hardship. I learned to expect nothing from my family, and to rely only on myself, lessons that would serve me well in the years to come. During my sophomore year of college, I came home for Thanksgiving to find that Daniel had dropped out of school after 3 semesters of partying and failing classes. Instead of disappointment or consequences, my parents met this news with understanding and support. College wasn't for everyone, they explained, and they were proud of Daniel for being mature enough to recognize that he needed a different path. They welcomed him back home with open arms and immediately began helping him explore other options. Maybe he could work in the family business and eventually take it over. Maybe he could learn a trade or start his own company. Whatever he wanted to do, they would support him completely. The contrast with how they had treated my college choice was staggering. When I had deviated from their expectations by choosing computer science over something more traditional, I was rebellious and stubborn. When Daniel dropped out of college entirely, he was mature and self-aware. That same Thanksgiving, when I mentioned that I was considering adding a minor in business to complement my computer science degree, my parents barely looked up from their conversation with Daniel about his future plans. When I shared that I had been selected for a competitive internship with a tech startup in Boulder, they nodded absently and changed the subject back to Daniel's job prospects. The pattern continued throughout my college years. Every achievement I earned was met with minimal acknowledgement, while every setback or struggle Daniel faced became a family crisis requiring all hands on deck to solve. When I made the dean's list, I got a brief "that's nice" before the conversation moved on to more important topics. When Daniel got a speeding ticket, my parents spent weeks helping him find a lawyer and negotiating payment plans. But the most devastating example of the favoritism came during my senior year of college. I had been working on a software project with a team of classmates, developing an app that helped small businesses manage their inventory and sales. The project was successful enough that we decided to enter it in a national competition for student entrepreneurs. After months of refining our pitch and business plan, we made it to the final round of the competition, which offered a prize of $50,000 in seed funding for the winning team. I was thrilled and nervous as I called home to share the news with my family. My mother's response was tepid at best. "That sounds nice, Misha. Just remember not to get your hopes up too high. These competitions are usually rigged anyway." When I tried to explain how significant this opportunity could be for my future career, she cut me off to ask if I had heard about Daniel's new girlfriend and how wonderful she was. The final competition was held in Chicago, and participants were allowed to invite family members to attend the presentation and awards ceremony. I desperately wanted my parents to be there, to see me present the project I had worked so hard on, to witness what I hoped would be a major milestone in my career. When I asked if they would consider coming to Chicago for the competition, my mother immediately began listing reasons why it wouldn't be possible. The landscaping business was entering its busy season, they couldn't afford the travel expenses, and besides, these things were probably boring for people who didn't understand technology. I offered to pay for their flights and hotel rooms with money I had saved from my internship, but they continued to find excuses. Finally, my father ended the conversation by saying that successful people didn't need their parents cheering them on like children, and I should be mature enough to handle these things independently. 2 weeks later, Daniel mentioned that he had been invited to his girlfriend's sister's wedding in Las Vegas, and my parents immediately began planning a family trip to support him. They booked flights, reserved hotel rooms, and took time off work to attend a wedding for someone they had never met, simply because Daniel wanted them to be there. The message was clear: Daniel's social events were worthy of time, money, and effort. My professional achievements were not. I won the competition. My team's app took first place, earning us the $50,000 in seed funding plus mentorship from successful entrepreneurs. It was the most significant accomplishment of my life up to that point, validation that my skills and hard work could lead to real success. When I called home with the news, my mother's response was exactly what I had come to expect. "Oh, that's nice. Daniel will be so proud when he hears." Speaking of Daniel, did we tell you he got promoted to assistant manager at the restaurant? We're taking him out to celebrate this weekend. That phone call was a turning point for me. As I sat in my empty dorm room, holding a check for $50,000 while my mother gushed about Daniel's promotion to a job that paid barely above minimum wage, I realized that I would never get the recognition or support I craved from my family. No achievement would ever be significant enough to earn their attention. No success would ever be impressive enough to make them proud. But more importantly, I realized that I didn't need their approval to succeed. The validation I had been seeking from my family could come from other sources, from professors who recognized my potential, from classmates who valued my contributions, from employers who appreciated my skills. The family that had raised me would never be the family I needed, but I could build the career and life I wanted without them. The prize money from the competition became the seed funding for my first real business venture. Instead of joining an established tech company after graduation, I decided to start my own software development firm, focusing on creating custom applications for small businesses. It was risky, especially without any financial safety net from my family, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions based solely on my own judgment and ambitions, not trying to earn approval from people who would never give it. The early years of building my business were challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. The technical aspects of software development came naturally to me, but learning to manage clients, handle finances, and market my services required skills I had to develop on the fly. There were months when I barely broke even, living on ramen noodles and sleeping in my office to save money on rent. But there were also moments of incredible satisfaction. When a small business owner called to tell me that the inventory management system I had created had saved them thousands of dollars and hours of work, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was entirely my own. When my client base grew large enough that I needed to hire additional developers, I experienced a pride that no family approval could have matched. As my business grew, so did my confidence. I began to see that the skills I had developed through years of self-reliance, the resilience I had built through constant criticism, and the independence I had been forced to cultivate were actually assets in the entrepreneurial world. While other business owners struggled with self-doubt or relied too heavily on external validation, I had already learned to trust my own judgment and persist through difficulties. Meanwhile, my family continued to treat Daniel as their primary focus and investment. Every time I came home for holidays or family gatherings, the conversation centered around Daniel's latest ventures and challenges. He had moved from job to job, never quite finding his footing, but each career change was presented as a learning experience that was preparing him for future success. When Daniel decided to try his hand at freelance graphic design, despite having no formal training or natural artistic ability, my parents praised his entrepreneurial spirit and loaned him money to buy expensive equipment. When his design business predictably failed after 6 months, they comforted him and helped him transition to his next idea without any criticism or consequences. The contrast with how they had always treated my ambitions was stark. When I had started my software company, they had questioned whether I was being realistic and warned me about the high failure rate of small businesses. When Daniel started his doomed design venture, they celebrated his courage and vision.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
By my late 20s, my software company had grown into a mid-sized firm with 15 employees and clients across multiple states. We specialized in developing custom applications for retail businesses, helping them manage everything from inventory to customer relationships to financial reporting. The work was challenging and rewarding, and the company was profitable enough to provide me with a comfortable lifestyle and the financial security I had never expected to achieve. But success in business didn't fill the emotional void left by my family's continued indifference. Every milestone I reached was celebrated alone or with friends and colleagues, but never with the people who had raised me. When I bought my first house, a small but beautiful cottage in a trendy neighborhood of Denver, my parents' response was polite but distant. They toured the house dutifully when I invited them over, but spent most of the visit asking when Daniel was going to find a nice place of his own. The pattern had become so predictable that I stopped expecting anything different. Family gatherings were exercises in patience, where I listened to lengthy discussions about Daniel's life while contributing updates about my own business that were met with brief nods before the conversation returned to more interesting topics. Daniel, for his part, seemed oblivious to the disparity in how we were treated. He accepted my parents' financial support and emotional investment as his due, never questioning why the same resources weren't available to me. When I achieved business milestones that should have been cause for family celebration, he offered perfunctory congratulations before launching into stories about his own experiences and challenges. The most painful part wasn't the lack of recognition or support. It was the growing realization that my family simply didn't see me as someone whose life and achievements mattered. I wasn't an antagonist to them, just irrelevant. My successes didn't threaten them, but they didn't inspire pride either. I had become background noise in my own family, present but not particularly noticed or valued. This understanding crystallized during my 30th birthday celebration. I had organized a small party at my house, inviting my family along with friends and colleagues. As the evening progressed, I noticed that my parents spent most of their time talking with my business associates, asking detailed questions about the tech industry and expressing amazement at the size and scope of my company. To my colleagues, my parents presented themselves as proud and supportive, bragging about my accomplishments and taking credit for having raised such a successful daughter. But when the guests left and only family remained, the facade dropped immediately. The conversation shifted back to Daniel's latest job search and relationship drama, as if my birthday party had been an inconvenient interruption to more important family business. That night, as I cleaned up after the party, I realized that my parents were capable of recognizing and celebrating success. They simply chose not to do so when it came to me. Their indifference wasn't the result of different values or inability to understand my career. It was a deliberate decision to prioritize Daniel's needs and achievements over mine. The revelation was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it meant I could stop trying to earn something that would never be given freely. Devastating because it confirmed that the people who should have been my biggest supporters had chosen to be spectators instead. But understanding the dynamic also gave me power. For the first time, I could see clearly how my family operated, where their priorities lay, and what motivated their decisions. More importantly, I could begin to make strategic choices about how much of myself to invest in relationships that would never provide the return I deserved. The final straw came 6 months later, during what would become known in my memory as the rope incident. Daniel had been living with my parents for nearly 2 years after his latest career setback, during which he had accumulated significant credit card debt and defaulted on several loans. Rather than face the consequences of his financial irresponsibility, he had asked my parents to co-sign for a consolidation loan that would pay off his existing debts and give him a fresh start. My parents, ever supportive of their golden child, had agreed without hesitation, but the loan required collateral, and after reviewing their assets, the bank had suggested using the landscaping business and the family home as security for the $50,000 loan. This was where I came into the picture, though not by choice. Because I had been successful in business and had excellent credit, Daniel had convinced my parents that I should co-sign the loan as well, providing additional security and better terms. According to Daniel's logic, which my parents had apparently accepted without question, I owed the family this favor because they had raised me and given me opportunities that had led to my success. The fact that they had provided Daniel with significantly more support and opportunities than they had ever given me was conveniently ignored in this calculation. The narrative had been rewritten so that my achievements were the result of family investment that now required repayment, while Daniel's failures were unfortunate circumstances that deserved continued support. When my parents called to inform me about the loan and my expected participation, I was initially too shocked to respond effectively. The presumption was breathtaking. They had never asked for my input on major family decisions, never sought my advice on Daniel's various career changes, never included me in conversations about his financial problems. But now that they needed something from me, I was suddenly expected to participate without question. I explained calmly that I would not be co-signing a loan for Daniel, particularly one that used family assets as collateral. I pointed out that Daniel had a pattern of financial irresponsibility and that this loan would likely end up in default, putting my parents' home and business at risk. I offered instead to help Daniel find a financial counselor or debt management program that could help him address his underlying spending problems. My parents' response was swift and furious. How dare I be so selfish and ungrateful? After everything they had done for me, this was how I repaid them. Daniel was family, and family members supported each other in times of need. My refusal to help was evidence of the cold, calculating nature that had always made me difficult to love. Daniel's reaction was even more extreme. He accused me of being jealous of his relationship with our parents and trying to sabotage his future out of spite. He claimed that my success had made me arrogant and that I looked down on the family that had raised me. Most damaging, he suggested that I was punishing him for being loved in ways that I never was, as if my parents' favoritism had been his fault rather than their choice. The argument escalated over several days, with my parents calling repeatedly to pressure me into changing my mind. They tried guilt, claiming that my refusal was breaking up the family. They tried manipulation, suggesting that helping Daniel was really helping them since they had co-signed the loan. They tried bribery, offering to include me in more family decisions if I proved my loyalty through this gesture. When none of these tactics worked, they tried threats. If I didn't sign the loan papers by the end of the week, I would no longer be welcome in their home. They would tell extended family members about my selfishness, ensuring that I would be ostracized from all family gatherings and events. Most creatively, they suggested that they might need to reconsider their will if I couldn't be counted on to support family members in need. Through all of this pressure, I remained firm in my refusal. The loan was a bad idea that would likely end in disaster for everyone involved. I was not responsible for fixing Daniel's financial problems, especially when he had made no effort to change the spending habits that had created them. Most importantly, I would not be manipulated into making a major financial decision based on guilt and family pressure. The final confrontation took place on a Saturday evening in early March. I had been invited to dinner at my parents' house under the pretense of having a calm family discussion about the situation. When I arrived, I found my parents, Daniel and his girlfriend Maria, waiting in the living room with serious expressions and a stack of loan documents on the coffee table. What followed was an intervention of sorts, with each family member taking turns explaining why I needed to sign the papers and how my refusal was hurting everyone. My mother cried about the stress this situation was causing and how disappointed she was in my lack of compassion. My father lectured me about family obligations and the importance of loyalty. Daniel's girlfriend, who barely knew me, shared her perspective on how families should support each other through difficult times. But it was Daniel himself who delivered the most manipulative performance. With tears in his eyes, he talked about how much my parents had sacrificed to raise both of us and how this was my chance to give back to the people who had loved me unconditionally. He painted a picture of his financial problems as temporary setbacks that anyone could experience, while portraying my success as lucky breaks that I hadn't fully earned. Most insidiously, he suggested that my refusal to help was evidence that I had never really considered myself part of the family. According to his narrative, I had always held myself apart, acting superior and ungrateful, and this loan situation was simply the latest example of my selfish nature. When the emotional appeals ended, my parents presented an ultimatum. I could sign the loan papers and remain part of the family, or I could maintain my selfish position and lose my relationship with them permanently. They had already spoken to other relatives about the situation, painting me as the ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her family in their time of need. I looked around the room at these people who shared my DNA but had never truly accepted me as one of their own. For 30 years, I had tried to earn their love and approval, adjusting my behavior and swallowing my needs in hopes of finally being seen as worthy of their support. But this moment made it clear that their acceptance would always be conditional, dependent on my willingness to serve their interests rather than my own. I stood up from the couch and walked toward the door, intending to leave with my dignity intact. But Daniel wasn't finished with his performance. He jumped up and blocked my path, demanding that I at least explain why I was being so cruel to the family that had raised me. When I tried to move around him, he grabbed my wrist and pulled me back toward the seating area. His grip was tight enough to hurt, and when I tried to pull away, he tightened his hold and began lecturing me about family loyalty and gratitude. That's when my father produced the rope. Later I would understand that they had planned this escalation, convinced that physical restraint and intimidation would succeed where emotional manipulation had failed. In the moment, though, I was simply terrified as my own family worked together to tie me to the dining room chair, ignoring my protests and demands to be released. For 2 hours, I sat bound in that chair, while they took turns explaining why I needed to sign the loan documents. The physical restraint was intended to force me to listen to their arguments without the option of leaving, but the psychological impact was much more profound. My own family had literally tied me up to coerce me into a financial decision that would put me at risk for their benefit. The rope wasn't tight enough to cut off circulation, but it was secure enough that I couldn't free myself. More importantly, it was a clear message that my autonomy and consent were irrelevant when they conflicted with family needs. I was not a person with rights and boundaries, but a resource to be used for their purposes. During those 2 hours, as I listened to their repetitive arguments and threats, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The fear and shock gave way to a cold clarity about who these people really were and what our relationship had always been. They were not a family that had failed to appreciate me. They were predators who had identified me as a source of financial security and were willing to use any means necessary to access it. When they finally untied me, convinced that the experience had broken my resistance, I calmly asked for a pen to sign the documents. For a moment they were triumphant, believing that their tactics had worked. But instead of signing the loan papers, I wrote a single sentence across the top page, signed under duress after being physically restrained against my will. The room erupted in anger and accusations. How dare I imply that they had done anything wrong? They were just trying to help me understand the importance of family loyalty. The restraint had been for my own good, to keep me from making a decision I would regret later. I left the house that night knowing I would never return as a daughter seeking approval. The family that had raised me had revealed themselves completely, and I finally understood that I had never been their child, just their mark. The rope marks on my wrists would fade over time, but they had served their purpose in opening my eyes to the truth about the people who should have loved me unconditionally. 3 days later, I hired a security company to change all the locks on my house and install a comprehensive alarm system. I closed all joint accounts and removed my parents as emergency contacts from every medical, financial, and legal document. I contacted a lawyer to ensure that my business assets were protected from any potential claims or interference from family members. Most importantly, I began to document everything. Every threatening phone call, every guilt-inducing text message, every attempt to manipulate me into changing my mind about the loan was recorded and saved. I had learned that people who would tie up a family member to coerce financial cooperation were capable of almost anything, and I wanted evidence of their behavior if legal protection became necessary. The loan, predictably, was approved without my participation after my parents agreed to put up additional collateral. Daniel received his $50,000 and immediately used it to pay off his existing debts and fund what he described as a foolproof business opportunity, selling luxury skincare products through social media marketing. Within 6 months, the skincare venture had failed, Daniel had accumulated new debts, and my parents were facing the possibility of losing their home and business to cover the defaulted loan. But by then, I was no longer available to serve as their financial backup plan. I had moved on to building a life where my worth wasn't determined by my willingness to sacrifice my own interests for people who had never valued me. The first month after cutting ties with my family was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. For 30 years, I had lived with the constant undercurrent of seeking their approval, even when I consciously rejected it. Their opinions had been background noise in every decision I made, their expectations a weight I carried whether I acknowledged it or not.
Suddenly, that noise was gone, replaced by a silence that felt both peaceful and unsettling. My business became my refuge and my obsession. Without family obligations or the emotional drain of managing their expectations, I found myself with unprecedented focus and energy. I threw myself into work with an intensity that surprised even me, staying late at the office and spending weekends developing new software solutions. The company had been growing steadily for years, but in the months following my break with my family, it experienced explosive expansion. We landed 3 major contracts in quick succession, including one with a national retail chain that wanted custom inventory management software for over 200 locations. The project was worth more than my company had made in the previous 2 years combined. Success bred success. Word spread through the industry about our innovative approach to retail software, and suddenly we were fielding inquiries from companies across the country. I hired 10 new employees in 6 months, moved to a larger office space, and began developing specialized software packages that could be customized for different types of businesses. But the most significant change wasn't professional, it was personal. For the first time in my life, I began to understand what it felt like to live without the constant anxiety of disappointing people who would never be satisfied. The hypervigilance that had defined my childhood, the careful monitoring of moods and reactions, the exhausting work of trying to anticipate and prevent criticism, all of it simply evaporated. I started sleeping better, food tasted better, colors seemed brighter. It was as if I had been living my entire life with a low-grade fever that had finally broken, leaving me clear-headed and energetic in ways I had never experienced. The freedom to make decisions based solely on my own judgment was intoxicating. I bought art for my home because I liked it, not because it would impress visitors. I traveled to conferences in cities I wanted to explore rather than choosing based on cost or convenience. I started saying yes to social invitations and no to requests that didn't align with my priorities. Most importantly, I began to build genuine relationships. Without the emotional exhaustion of managing family dysfunction, I had energy to invest in friendships and professional connections. I joined a business networking group for women entrepreneurs and discovered a community of accomplished, supportive women who celebrated each other's successes without jealousy or competition. Through the networking group, I met Sarah Chen, a real estate developer who became one of my closest friends. Sarah had built her own company from the ground up after leaving a corporate job where her ideas were consistently stolen by male colleagues. She understood the particular challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated field and the satisfaction of succeeding on your own terms. Sarah was the first person I told about my family situation. Over dinner one evening, she noticed the silver bracelet I always wore and asked about it. Something about her genuine curiosity and non-judgmental demeanor made me feel safe enough to share the truth. Her reaction was exactly what I needed. No pity, no attempts to minimize what had happened, no suggestions that I should try to reconcile with people who had tied me to a chair. Instead, she listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and then said simply that she was glad I had gotten away from them and built something better for myself. Sarah introduced me to her circle of friends, successful professional women who had all overcome various challenges to build careers and lives on their own terms. For the first time, I found myself part of a chosen family that celebrated achievements, supported each other through setbacks, and never used love as a weapon to control behavior. The contrast with my biological family was stark and healing. When I mentioned a business milestone or personal accomplishment, These women responded with genuine enthusiasm and interest. When I faced challenges or setbacks, they offered practical support and encouragement rather than criticism or lectures about gratitude. Through this new social network, I also met Marcus Thompson, a software engineer who had left a lucrative job at a tech giant to start his own cybersecurity consulting firm. Marcus was intelligent, ambitious, and kind, with a dry sense of humor that made even stressful business situations seem manageable. Dating had always been complicated for me. The dysfunction of my family relationships had left me with trust issues and difficulty recognizing healthy emotional dynamics. I had a pattern of either choosing partners who were emotionally unavailable or pushing away men who showed genuine interest and affection. But Marcus was different. He was patient with my cautiousness, consistent in his behavior, and transparent about his own thoughts and feelings. When I told him about my family situation, he didn't try to fix it or offer unwanted advice. He simply listened and supported whatever decisions I made about contact and boundaries. More importantly, Marcus understood the demands of building a business and respected my ambition. He never suggested that I should scale back my work or prioritize our relationship over my career goals. Instead, he found ways to support my success and celebrated my achievements as enthusiastically as his own. As my personal life stabilized and flourished, my business continued to grow. The retail software that had started as custom solutions for individual clients evolved into comprehensive packages that could be adapted for different industries. We developed specialized versions for restaurants, automotive dealers, clothing stores, and electronics retailers. The expansion required significant investment in infrastructure and personnel. I hired a chief technology officer to oversee software development, a marketing director to manage client relationships, and a financial controller to handle the increasingly complex business operations. By my 32nd birthday, the company employed 45 people across 3 offices. The success was gratifying, but it also brought new challenges. Managing a growing company required different skills than developing software or working with individual clients. I had to learn about human resources, corporate finance, and strategic planning. I enrolled in executive education courses and worked with a business coach to develop leadership skills. Most importantly, I had to learn to delegate responsibility and trust other people to represent my vision. This was particularly difficult, given my history of self-reliance and control. For years, I had succeeded by depending only on myself and maintaining tight oversight of every aspect of my work. Building a larger organization required letting go of that control while ensuring that quality and standards remained high. The learning curve was steep and sometimes frustrating. There were months when I questioned whether the expansion was worth the stress and complexity it added to my life. Managing employee conflicts, navigating client relationships, and balancing competing priorities required emotional skills I was still developing. But gradually I found my footing as a leader. The same analytical approach that had served me well in software development proved useful for organizational challenges. I learned to break complex problems into manageable components, gather information systematically, and make decisions based on data rather than emotion. More importantly, I discovered that the empathy I had developed through my own difficult experiences made me a better manager. I understood what it felt like to be undervalued and overlooked, so I made sure to recognize employee contributions and create opportunities for professional growth. I knew the importance of feeling heard and respected, so I implemented systems for feedback and communication. The company culture that emerged reflected these values. We had low turnover, high employee satisfaction, and a reputation as an excellent place to work in the local tech industry. When we won a regional award for workplace excellence, I felt a pride that was entirely different from the business success metrics. This was proof that I could create the kind of supportive, respectful environment I had always wanted to experience. As my professional reputation grew, I began receiving invitations to speak at conferences and industry events. The first few times were nerve-wracking, but I discovered that I enjoyed sharing knowledge and connecting with other entrepreneurs. My presentations on custom software development and business scaling strategies were well received, leading to more speaking opportunities and media interviews. The visibility brought additional business opportunities but also unwanted attention from my biological family. After 2 years of silence, I began receiving calls and messages from my parents and Daniel. The tone had shifted dramatically from the anger and threats that had characterized our final interactions. Now they were reaching out with congratulations on my success, claiming to have always known I would accomplish great things. They had seen articles about my company in business magazines and wanted me to know how proud they were. Daniel, in particular, seemed eager to reconnect, suggesting that we had both matured since our last conflict and should put the past behind us. The messages were carefully crafted to avoid acknowledging what had actually happened during our final confrontation. There was no mention of the loan, the physical restraint, or the years of favoritism and neglect. Instead, they painted a revisionist history, where our estrangement had been the result of a misunderstanding that could easily be resolved. I didn't respond to any of the outreach. The silence I maintained wasn't born of anger or spite, but of clear-eyed understanding of who these people were and what they wanted. They weren't reaching out because they had experienced genuine remorse or personal growth. They were reaching out because my success had made me valuable to them again. The timing of their contact confirmed this assessment. My parents' landscaping business was struggling with increased competition and changing market dynamics. Daniel had gone through several more failed ventures and was working in sales for a telecommunications company, barely making ends meet. Meanwhile, my success had been documented in trade publications and local business journals, making it impossible to ignore or dismiss. Their sudden desire for reconciliation wasn't motivated by love or family loyalty. It was motivated by the same calculation that had led to the loan incident. I had resources they wanted access to, and they were willing to use emotional manipulation to get them. Instead of engaging with their attempts at contact, I focused on building the life and relationships I actually wanted. Marcus and I had been dating for over a year, and our relationship had developed into something deeper and more stable than I had ever experienced. He proposed during a weekend trip to San Francisco, at a restaurant overlooking the bay where we had eaten on our third date. The engagement brought a new kind of happiness, but also anxiety about how to navigate the practical aspects of merging our lives. Marcus had a large, close-knit family, who welcomed me warmly but couldn't quite understand why my own relatives wouldn't be involved in the wedding planning or celebration. His parents, Jim and Linda Thompson, were kind, generous people who had supported all 4 of their children through college and various career changes. They had a family tradition of Sunday dinners where everyone gathered to share news and catch up on each other's lives. The atmosphere was warm and supportive, everything my own family gatherings had never been. But their normalcy also highlighted the abnormality of my own background. When they asked about my parents' preferences for wedding venues or guest lists, I had to explain that my family wouldn't be attending. When they suggested meeting my parents to discuss wedding arrangements, I had to decline without providing details that would horrify them. Jim and Linda were too polite to push for explanations, but I could see their confusion and concern. In their world, family conflicts were resolved through communication and compromise. The idea that parents and children could have irreparable differences was foreign to their experience. Marcus helped navigate these conversations with sensitivity and tact. He had told his family that my relationships with my parents were complicated, and that I preferred not to discuss the details. When relatives asked questions, he redirected the conversation smoothly, protecting my privacy while maintaining the warm family atmosphere. Planning a wedding without family involvement was both easier and more complicated than I had expected. There were fewer opinions to manage and no competing visions to reconcile, but there was also an absence that felt significant even when I didn't want it to matter. Sarah stepped in as my maid of honor and helped coordinate details that might traditionally have been handled by my mother. Marcus's sister Jennifer offered to include me in family traditions and celebrations, creating a sense of belonging that was both healing and bittersweet. The wedding itself was exactly what Marcus and I wanted, an elegant but intimate celebration with 50 guests at a historic venue in downtown Denver. The absence of my biological family was noticeable to me but didn't diminish the joy of the occasion. I was surrounded by people who had chosen to be part of my life and who celebrated our happiness without reservation. Our honeymoon was a 2-week trip to New Zealand, a destination I had dreamed of visiting since college. The timing was perfect for getting away from work responsibilities and focusing on the new phase of our relationship. We hiked through national parks, explored wineries, and talked about our goals for building a life together. When we returned to Denver, I felt more settled and confident than ever before. The success of my business, the stability of my marriage, and the community of friends and colleagues I had built created a foundation of security I had never experienced. For the first time, I understood what it meant to have a life that was genuinely mine, built on my own choices and values rather than reactions to other people's expectations. The company continued to expand, but at a more sustainable pace.
I had learned to balance growth with quality of life, taking time for travel and personal interests rather than working constantly. Marcus and I bought a larger house in a neighborhood we both loved, with space for home offices and entertaining. I also began investing in real estate, initially as a way to diversify my assets but increasingly as a business interest. Sarah taught me about property development and market analysis, and I discovered that the same analytical skills that had served me well in software development were applicable to real estate investment. My first investment was a small office building that I purchased, renovated, and leased to other technology companies. The project was successful enough to encourage additional investments, and within 2 years I had assembled a portfolio of commercial and residential properties across the Denver metro area. The real estate investments provided passive income that allowed me to take more risks with the software company. I could pursue innovative projects and longer-term development initiatives without worrying about immediate cash flow. The financial security was empowering in ways that went beyond the practical benefits, but the most significant change was psychological. The frightened, approval-seeking girl who had been tied to a chair for refusing to enable her cousin's irresponsibility was gone, replaced by a confident woman who made decisions based on her own judgment and lived according to her own values. I had created not just financial success but emotional freedom. The opinions of people who had never valued me no longer held power over my choices. The fear of disappointing others had been replaced by confidence in my own decision-making. The desperate need for external validation had been satisfied by internal satisfaction with the life I had built. 3 years into my marriage, Marcus and I decided to start a family. The decision was both exciting and anxiety-provoking, given my own difficult childhood experiences. I worried about whether I would know how to be a good parent, whether the dysfunction of my upbringing had damaged my ability to create healthy family relationships. But Marcus was patient with my concerns and confident in our ability to build something better than what either of us had experienced. His own family provided a model of supportive, loving relationships that helped me envision what we could create together. When our daughter Emma was born, I experienced a love that was unlike anything I had ever felt. The fierce protectiveness and unconditional devotion I felt for her helped me understand just how abnormal my own parents' behavior had been. No achievement or failure on Emma's part could ever affect my love for her. No external pressure could ever make me treat her as less valuable than another child. Holding Emma in the hospital, I made promises that I had never heard as a child. She would always be loved for who she was, not what she accomplished. Her worth would never be contingent on serving other people's needs. She would grow up knowing that she deserved respect, kindness, and protection from the people who claimed to love her. The contrast with my own childhood was stark and healing. Emma's first smiles, first words, and first steps were celebrated with genuine joy rather than compared to other children's achievements. Her needs and preferences were considered important rather than dismissed as inconvenient. Her personality was encouraged to develop rather than criticized as deficient. Becoming a mother also gave me new perspective on my own parents' choices. The unconditional love I felt for Emma made their conditional treatment of me seem even more cruel and incomprehensible. No external circumstance could excuse tying up your own child or prioritizing one child's needs over another's basic dignity. But motherhood also brought practical challenges that required careful navigation. Emma's birth announcement prompted another wave of contact attempts from my biological family. They wanted to meet their granddaughter, to be part of her life, to have the chance to build relationships with the next generation. The messages were more persistent and emotionally manipulative than previous attempts. They claimed that keeping Emma away from her grandparents was harmful to her development, that children needed extended family connections, that I was punishing them by denying them the chance to love their granddaughter. Daniel was particularly aggressive in his outreach, suggesting that whatever problems we had in the past shouldn't affect Emma's opportunity to know her family.
He painted himself as the loving uncle who wanted only to spoil his niece and create happy memories with her. The pressure was intense and sometimes made me question my decision to maintain no contact. Were my boundaries too rigid? Was I depriving Emma of potentially meaningful relationships? Would she blame me later for keeping her away from her biological extended family? But then I would remember the rope around my wrists, the years of favoritism and neglect, the calculated cruelty that had characterized my own childhood. I would imagine Emma experiencing the same treatment, being told she was less valuable than another child, having her achievements dismissed while her failures were used as evidence of her inadequacy. The choice became clear. My job as Emma's mother was to protect her from harm, not to provide access to people who had proven themselves capable of psychological and physical abuse. Blood relationships that were toxic were worse than no relationships at all. I also realized that my biological family's sudden interest in Emma wasn't motivated by genuine love or desire for connection. They had shown no interest in building a healthy relationship with me, acknowledging their past behavior, or demonstrating personal growth. They simply wanted access to the next generation, presumably hoping that becoming grandparents and aunt would provide them with the emotional fulfillment and social status they had failed to earn through their treatment of me. Their attempts to guilt me into contact by claiming concern for Emma's well-being were particularly transparent. If they truly cared about her best interests, they would have started by trying to repair their relationship with her mother. The fact that they bypassed accountability and went straight to demanding access revealed that their motivations were selfish rather than child-centered. As Emma grew from infant to toddler, my confidence in the no-contact decision only strengthened. She was a happy, confident child surrounded by people who genuinely loved and supported her. Marcus's family had embraced her completely, providing her with grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins who celebrated her existence and looked forward to watching her grow. Sarah and my other close friends became chosen aunts who took active interest in Emma's development and milestones. She had no shortage of adults who cared about her well-being and wanted to be part of her life. The absence of my biological family created space for healthier relationships, rather than leaving a void that needed to be filled. By Emma's second birthday, I had stopped reading the messages from my biological family altogether. Their attempts at contact had become predictable and repetitive, cycling through the same manipulative tactics without acknowledging the fundamental issues that had led to our estrangement. Instead of engaging with their attempts to rewrite history or minimize their behavior, I focused on building the life and relationships I wanted. Emma was thriving in an environment of unconditional love and respect. My marriage was strong and supportive. My business continued to grow and evolve. My friendships were deep and meaningful. The success wasn't just professional or financial, though both were significant. It was the deeper satisfaction of having created something genuine and sustainable, built on healthy foundations rather than dysfunction and manipulation. Every aspect of my life reflected choices I had made consciously and deliberately, rather than reactions to other people's expectations or demands. The real estate portfolio had grown to include 12 properties, generating enough passive income to provide complete financial independence if needed. The software company employed 62 people and had expanded into new markets, including healthcare and education technology. My personal net worth had reached levels I could never have imagined during my childhood. But the most meaningful success was the peace I felt when I woke up each morning, the absence of anxiety about disappointing people or managing their moods, the freedom to make decisions based on my own values and priorities. I had broken the cycle of dysfunction that had characterized my childhood and created something entirely different for my own daughter. As Emma approached her third birthday, I began to understand that my journey wasn't just about escaping a toxic family situation. It was about proving to myself and to anyone facing similar challenges that it was possible to build something better. The frightened girl who had been told she was worthless had become a woman who created value wherever she went. The child who had been treated as a burden had become an adult who contributed to her community and built meaningful relationships. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. I still struggled with trust issues and the tendency to be hyper-vigilant about other people's moods and motivations. I sometimes caught myself bracing for criticism or rejection that wasn't coming, responding to present situations based on past experiences rather than current reality. but I had developed tools for recognizing these patterns and correcting them. Therapy had taught me to question my automatic assumptions and respond to people based on their actual behavior rather than my historical expectations. The supportive relationships in my life provided constant evidence that not all families were dysfunctional, that love could be genuine and unconditional. Most importantly, I had learned that healing wasn't a destination but an ongoing process. There would always be triggers and challenges that brought up old wounds, but I had developed the skills and support systems to handle them constructively rather than destructively. The journey had taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to treat you with basic respect. That family relationships built on manipulation and conditional approval are worse than no family relationships at all. That the people who truly matter will love you for who you are, not what you can provide them. As I watched Emma play in our backyard, surrounded by the life Marcus and I had built together, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with external achievements or recognition. This was what success really looked like: the freedom to love and be loved authentically, to make choices based on your own values, to create something meaningful rather than just react to other people's dysfunction. The rope marks on my wrists had faded to barely visible lines, but the strength they represented had only grown. I had learned that sometimes you have to be tied down before you can truly break free, that the people who try to control you often end up teaching you just how powerful you really are. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant informed me that someone claiming to be my cousin was on the line, saying it was urgent. I hadn't heard Daniel's voice in 4 years, and it sounded older, more strained than I remembered. He was calling about my parents. My father had suffered a stroke 3 weeks earlier and was in intensive care. My mother was overwhelmed trying to manage his care while keeping the landscaping business running. They needed help and Daniel couldn't provide it. His telecommunications job had been eliminated in corporate restructuring, and he was behind on his own bills. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family that had tied me to a chair, demanding I co-sign a loan, was now asking for assistance from the daughter they had dismissed as selfish and ungrateful. Daniel's tone was different now, less demanding and more desperate. He acknowledged that we had issues in the past, but hoped I could put them aside in this family crisis. I listened without interrupting, then told him I would consider his request and call back. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it left me unsettled in ways I hadn't expected. These people had shaped my childhood with their cruelty and favoritism, yet hearing about my father's vulnerability stirred something that felt uncomfortably like concern. Marcus found me staring out my office window an hour later. I told him about the call and my conflicted feelings. Part of me wanted to ignore their crisis completely, to let them experience the consequences of their choices without my interference. But another part was curious about what they had become, whether the years had taught them anything about the damage they had caused. That evening, I made some calls to people in their neighborhood. The picture that emerged was sobering. My parents' landscaping business was failing, victim to their inability to adapt to changing customer preferences and increased competition. They had lost most of their commercial accounts and were barely maintaining residential clients. My father's stroke had been severe, leaving him partially paralyzed and unable to work. My mother was drowning in medical bills and business debts, too proud to ask for help from anyone except the daughter she had spent 30 years dismissing. Daniel was living in a studio apartment across town, working odd jobs and struggling with his own financial problems. The family that had once seemed so powerful in their ability to hurt me had been reduced to ordinary people facing ordinary struggles. Their earlier success had been built on my grandfather's reputation and connections, advantages that had masked their lack of business acumen. Without that foundation, they had slowly declined into the kind of middle-class financial insecurity they had once looked down upon. I spent the next week researching their situation more thoroughly. Public records showed multiple liens against their property, defaulted business loans, and mounting medical debt. They were facing foreclosure within 60 days unless they could negotiate payment arrangements or find alternative financing. The house where I had grown up, where I had been called trash and physically restrained, was about to be lost to creditors. The landscaping business that had been my grandfather's legacy was collapsing under poor management and changing market conditions. The golden boy who had been lavished with support and resources was working at a call center for $12 an hour. Revenge should have tasted sweeter than it did. These were the people who had convinced me I was worthless while elevating someone who had proven incapable of building anything lasting. Justice would have been letting them face the consequences of their choices without interference from the daughter they had never valued. But as I sat in my home office looking at financial documents that told the story of their decline, I realized that revenge wasn't what I wanted anymore. The frightened girl who had dreamed of proving them wrong had been replaced by a woman who had already built everything she needed. Their validation was irrelevant because I had found genuine acceptance and love elsewhere. Instead of revenge, I wanted something more complex and satisfying. I wanted to demonstrate the difference between their approach to family relationships and mine. I wanted to show them what generosity looked like when it wasn't conditional or manipulative. Most importantly, I wanted to close this chapter of my life on my own terms, rather than theirs. The plan that formed over the following days was elegant in its simplicity. I would help them, but not in the way they expected or hoped. Rather than providing temporary financial assistance that would leave their fundamental problems unsolved, I would address their situation comprehensively while ensuring they understood exactly who was responsible for their salvation. Through my real estate investment company, I quietly purchased their mortgage from the bank for 60 cents on the dollar. The transaction was structured to keep my identity confidential until I chose to reveal it. I also bought out their business loans and negotiated payment arrangements for their medical debt. Daniel's landlord was planning to sell his apartment building to developers, which would displace him within 90 days. I arranged to purchase the building through a shell company, giving me control over his housing situation as well. The most satisfying acquisition was the house directly across the street from my parents' home. It had been on the market for months at a price that reflected needed renovations and an unmotivated seller. I bought it for cash and immediately began upgrading it into something spectacular. While contractors transformed the property into a showcase home, I planned the final act of this long drama. Daniel had mentioned in his phone call that my parents were planning a housewarming party for late November. It was an odd choice given their financial circumstances, but apparently they wanted to maintain appearances while they still could. The invitation arrived 3 weeks later, forwarded through Daniel since they didn't have my current address. The card was simple and dignified, inviting family and friends to celebrate 30 years in their home. There was a handwritten note from my mother expressing hope that I would attend despite our past difficulties. I RSVP'd affirmatively but didn't elaborate on my intentions. The party was scheduled for the Saturday before Thanksgiving, which gave me time to complete the house renovations and prepare for the conversation that was 4 years overdue. The morning of the party, I stood in the master bedroom of my new house, watching through the window as guests arrived at my parents' home. The contrast between the two properties was striking. Their house looked tired and worn, with peeling paint and an overgrown yard that spoke to my father's inability to maintain the standards he had once demanded. My house gleamed with fresh paint, professional landscaping, and architectural details that elevated it far above anything else in the neighborhood. The message was clear without being ostentatious. This was what success looked like when it was earned rather than inherited. I chose my outfit carefully, a simple but expensive dress that spoke to professional achievement without being flashy, and the silver bracelet that still covered the faint marks on my wrist. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a successful businesswoman who had built something meaningful from nothing. The gift I carried was wrapped in elegant paper with a simple bow. Inside was a vanilla candle from Target, the kind of generic present that could be purchased anywhere for $20. It was deliberately modest, the sort of gift that would reinforce their assumptions about my character and intentions. Walking across the street felt like crossing decades rather than yards. The last time I had approached this door, I had been a desperate 18-year-old looking for validation from people who would never provide it. Now I was returning as the woman I had built myself into, carrying power they couldn't even imagine. Daniel answered the door, and his reaction was everything I had hoped for. 4 years had not been kind to him. He looked older and softer, with the particular weariness that comes from repeated failures and diminished expectations. His smile was uncertain, as if he couldn't quite believe I had actually come. The house felt smaller than I remembered, shabby in ways that had nothing to do with financial struggles. The energy was different too, heavy with unspoken tensions and disappointment. Conversations were muted, and laughter seemed forced. This was a family that had lost its way without ever admitting they had been on the wrong path. My parents' reaction to my appearance was complex and revealing. My mother looked stunned, then pleased, then calculating. She introduced me to other guests as her successful daughter, the one with the technology company, as if my achievements reflected well on her parenting. My father, diminished by his stroke but still recognizable, watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I circulated through the party making polite conversation, listening to updates about relatives I barely remembered and neighbors I had never known well. Everyone was curious about my life and career, asking questions that my parents answered with a familiarity that suggested they had been following my success more closely than I had realized. The most interesting discovery was how they presented our relationship to others. According to the narrative they had constructed, we had grown apart due to busy schedules and geographic distance, not fundamental disagreements about values and treatment. I was the daughter who had moved away for work, not the child who had been driven away by abuse and favoritism. When it came time for gift opening, I presented my modest candle with appropriate ceremony. My mother thanked me graciously, though I could see her disappointment that I hadn't brought something more substantial. Other guests had given generous presents that reflected both their affection and their understanding of the family's financial struggles. After the formal gift exchange, I asked to speak with my parents privately. We gathered in the kitchen where so many painful conversations had taken place during my childhood. The room looked exactly the same, down to the outdated wallpaper and chipped countertops that spoke to deferred maintenance and declining resources. I began by acknowledging their financial difficulties and my father's health challenges. They were surprised that I knew the details, but I explained that Daniel's call had prompted me to research their situation. Understanding the scope of their problems had led me to take action on their behalf. From my purse I withdrew a folder containing documents that would change their lives. The mortgage papers showing that their loan had been purchased by my company and forgiven entirely. Business loan agreements that had been satisfied in full. Medical debt arrangements that eliminated their payment obligations. But the most significant document was the deed to the house we were sitting in. As of yesterday, I owned the property free and clear. They could continue living there for as long as they wished, with no rent or maintenance obligations, but the house now belonged to me. The silence that followed was profound. My mother stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language, while my father's eyes moved between the documents and my face with an expression of complete bewilderment. Daniel, who had followed us into the kitchen, was the first to speak. He wanted to know why I would help them after everything that had happened, what I wanted in return, whether this generosity came with conditions or expectations. I explained that my motivations were simple. I had the resources to solve their problems completely, and doing so cost me less than they might imagine. Their house had been purchased at a significant discount from a motivated lender. Their business debts had been negotiated down to manageable amounts. The medical bills had been settled for fractions of their original amounts. More importantly, I wanted to demonstrate the difference between their approach to family relationships and mine. They had always used resources as weapons, offering support conditionally and withdrawing it when someone failed to meet their expectations. I was offering help with no strings attached, no demands for gratitude or behavioral changes. But I also wanted them to understand exactly what had happened. The daughter they had dismissed as selfish and ungrateful was now wealthy enough to solve their problems without affecting her own lifestyle. The child they had tied to a chair to coerce financial cooperation now had the power to control their housing situation permanently. My mother was the first to cry, overwhelmed by relief and shame in equal measure. She thanked me repeatedly while apologizing for the way I had been treated, acknowledging that they had failed me as parents and didn't deserve my help. My father's response was more complex. The stroke had affected his speech, but his eyes remained sharp and calculating. He understood the implications of what I had done, the complete reversal of power between us. I was no longer the vulnerable child they could manipulate or control. I was their landlord, their creditor, their safety net. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. For the first time they listened when I spoke, asked questions about my life and choices, expressed interest in my daughter and husband. The dynamic had shifted fundamentally, and they were adapting to new realities with the pragmatism of people who recognize their complete dependence on someone else's generosity. But I made it clear that this help came with boundaries. I would ensure they had housing security and freedom from debt, but I would not be resuming the role of daughter seeking their approval. Emma would not be visiting or forming relationships with grandparents who had proven themselves capable of psychological abuse. My marriage and career would not be topics for their input or commentary. Most importantly, this generosity was not an invitation to renewed contact or involvement in my life. I was solving their problems to close this chapter permanently, not to reopen it under different circumstances. They accepted these conditions with the grace of people who understood they were in no position to negotiate. Daniel seemed particularly relieved that his housing situation was secure, though I could see him calculating whether this help extended to him personally or just to my parents. As I prepared to leave, my mother asked the question I had been expecting. Why had I really come back? Why help them after cutting contact so completely? The answer was something I had been working toward for years without fully realizing it. I had needed to prove to myself that I was capable of generosity even toward people who had harmed me, that success hadn't made me cruel or vindictive. I had wanted to demonstrate that strength could be used for protection and healing rather than punishment and control. Most importantly, I had wanted to end this relationship on my terms rather than theirs. By solving their problems completely, I had removed their ability to use crisis or need as tools for manipulation. They could no longer claim that family loyalty required me to sacrifice my own interests for theirs. Walking back across the street to my own house, I felt a satisfaction that was entirely different from business achievements or personal milestones. This was the completion of something that had begun 34 years earlier, when a little girl had first been told she was worthless. The rope marks on my wrist were barely visible now, but they had served their purpose. They had reminded me daily of what I had overcome and what I was building toward. Now they could fade completely, their lesson learned and integrated. From my new living room window, I could see my parents' house clearly. Tomorrow contractors would begin converting the space into something entirely different, a residential care facility specializing in stroke recovery and elder care. The irony was intentional. The house where I had been made to feel unwelcome would become a place where vulnerable people received compassion and support. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.